Hi there, welcome to class number 3 of the guitar class. I'm Greg Miller, and this week we're going to be looking at how to take some open chords and turn them into bar chords. And you'll have to think back to last week's lesson about the open E major chord and A major chord. And if you didn't see last week's lesson, you can send me a self-addressed stamped envelope and mail it in to me at the address at the end of the show. And I'll send you out all 12 of these lessons on paper, and then you can refer back and you can watch them look at them while you're watching the show. So what we'll talk about is how to form a bar chord and the theory behind the way a bar chord is formed and how an open chord is moved up the neck. Last week we looked at an E major chord and an A major chord, and an E major chord is played like that, with an open E string and your ring finger on the 2nd fret of the A string and your pinky on the 2nd fret of the D string and your middle finger on the 1st fret of the G string, and the B and E strings open. Now essentially what happens here is the strings that you don't have a finger on are being played at the nut. The nut acts sort of like your finger. That's where the string vibrates from. When you fret a note, the string starts to vibrate from that fret on. So if you want to take this chord and make it higher, you can't just take the fingers that are fretting a note and move them up a half step or 1 fret, because all the other ones then are out of sync. What you have to do is take all of those open strings that were played at the nut here and move them up a half step as well. And you do that by taking your index finger and just running it right across the strings like that. And then putting your other fingers on the fingerboard in the same shape as the open E major chord. Now the thing about guitar compared to a piano is when you play a different chord on a piano, if you play an E major chord and then an F major chord, they look totally different. On a guitar, the shape of the chord is always the same. It's the position on the neck that will change the name of the chord. So this is an E major chord. If I move it up a half step or 1 fret, the shape of the chord is identical. I still have my fingers relative to one another in all the same spots, but it's no longer an E major chord, it's now an F major chord. Every time you go up a fret, you go up 1 letter in the alphabet with the sharps and flats. And it would take a little while to explain it, but on the sheets that you can send in for, I can explain the note line to you, and I'll show you where the sharps and flats lie. I'll just run through it quickly now. There's a sharp between every 2 consecutive letter names in the musical alphabet, except between B and C and E and F. So the notes would be an E, and a half step higher would be an F, and an F sharp, and a G, and a G sharp, and an A, and an A sharp, and a B, and a C, and a C sharp, and a D, and a D sharp, and then an E. They repeat at the 12th fret again. If you think about bar chords as having 2 components, one being the shape of the chord, and the other important thing to remember is the root of the chord. We've talked about roots before. The root is the note that has the same letter name as the chord. So an E major chord, its root is an E. A C major chord, its root is a C. And when you're looking at bar chords, this shape of a bar chord anyway, the root note of the chord is played by the lowest string with your index finger. So if you learn the notes in a few specific spots on the low E string and the A string, what'll happen is that when somebody says to you play a G major chord, you will know where the G is, and you'll know what a major chord, the shape of a major chord is, and you'll be able to just fret the G and then form the shape of the chord that you want. And that works with a major chord or a minor chord or a dominant 7 chord. And we'll look at a couple more of those in a minute. That's one of the 2 basic major chord, minor chord shapes, bar chord forms. The other one is this A major chord. Now, last week I showed you that there's a couple ways to play that A major chord. You can either play it with your index finger or with your ring finger. Now when you're playing an open A major chord, what'll happen is if you play it with your index finger, sometimes it feels more comfortable to grab it like that. But when you start moving that chord up, you have no choice but to play it with your ring finger. Some people play it with their pinky. It's not a real good idea to do that because sometimes you take those chords and you add an extension on the end of them, and you need your pinky to do that. And if you're used to playing bar chords like that, you can't really get your pinky up there, and you'll have to learn to do it like that anyway. So it's just good practice. This bar chord tends to give people a lot of trouble because they have to push basically all of the strings down with two fingers. Couple things to watch for. When you play a bar chord like this, when you take that A major and move it up a half step, you'll be playing an A sharp major. That's the only note that you really have to bar in this chord, because this note should be muted, the highest string. These other three notes are being played with your ring finger, so it's sort of redundant to put a whole bunch of pressure on all the strings with your index finger when the only string you really need to fret is the A string. So when you're playing that chord, you don't have to worry about putting a whole bunch of pressure. You can keep your finger a bit arched and just play that, fret that one note with your index finger and fret the other three with your ring and mute the high one. With your index finger as well, if you touch the low E string a little bit, you'll be able to mute it and you'll be able to play the whole chord like that without worrying about having to miss the low E string. I think most of those problems you'll run into, and if you just keep working on it, things tend to work themselves out, especially if you can hear what the chord sounds like in your ear, and if you have a couple songs that you know that you can play the chord and identify with it, you'll get a feel for what should be done. And it's best not to worry about all those little technical things, like muting this and touching this. They tend to come real naturally. So let's take that E major chord and that A major chord and use it in a bit of a progression. Yeah, the riff to a Nirvana song called "Smells Like Teen Spirit" uses those two bar chord forms. The first chord is an E major, and the second chord's an A major. And the next chord's a G major, and then a C major. So what you have to do is play the E major, and then drop your finger down like that, play the A major, and then take that E major form and move it up 1, 2, 3 frets, so that your index finger's on a G, and play that G major chord, and then right underneath it is that C major chord. So those are the only 4 chords that are in it, and really they're only using 2 different types of forms of a major chord. The one with the root on the low E string, and the one with the root on the A string. And the rhythm of it and those 4 chords, well actually those 2 forms, and then you just move them all over, make up almost all the rock and roll stuff that you'll learn. They're real common rock and roll kind of chords, with a bit of distortion. Those chords kind of come to life. A lot of things are done with those chords in rock and roll to kind of mask them over. A lot of heavy metal stuff will do something that's sort of referred to as chugging or zhugging or something like that, where they, instead of playing the entire E major chord, they'll only play the lowest 2 notes. And you take this part of your hand again, the same part of your hand that you use to mute a chord, like we did in Back in Black last week. And you sort of rest it really almost exactly where the string leaves the tailpiece. You don't want to put it on the string way up like that, because it'll be totally dead. But you have to touch the string just slightly. And the note should go from to. Really deadened like that, really thuddy sounding. And they'll just basically play those lowest two notes. And they'll take that E major form that they're only playing the lowest two notes out of, and they'll move it up, just like we did with that, from an E major to an F major, and they'll just play the lowest two notes again. And they move it all over the neck. If you look at the lowest two notes in that form of the chord, you'll see that the higher note is one string higher and 2 frets higher. If you look at the A major chord, you'll see that the lower two notes have the same relationship. There's one, the root note is there, and the higher note is one string higher and 2 frets higher. So when you're looking at only playing the bottom end of these chords, or the lower parts of these chords, you tend to take away all that kind of prettier top end, and it ends up sounding real heavy and kind of thrudgy and stuff. But it's a real good idea not to get into the habit of just playing those two notes. It's a real good idea to get in the habit of fretting the whole chord as it should be fretted, and selecting to only play the lower two strings, because a lot of times what happens, you need to use those higher notes, and if you haven't played them, you're going to have a heck of a time trying to get your fingers down there if you're in the middle of kind of a riff or something like that. So basically, when you play the low two notes out of both of those forms, they look the same, and you'll see a lot of people playing and what they're really doing is selecting to only play the lowest two voices of those chords. Let's see, well, a Metallica tune uses those chords. They're playing, those real chords would actually be, but they only want to hear that bottomy kind of thing. So when you see people playing those two notes, really try to think about the fact that the whole chord still exists. They're just selecting to play those lower two notes. And you'll find too that after a while you may get a little tired of the sound of just those two notes, and you'll want to get some other notes in there. It really adds a lot of color to the chord. It gives it some life. Last week we looked at the E major chord, and then we modified the E major chord to give you an E dominant 7 chord. And we modified the A major chord to give you an A dominant 7 chord. Anything that you do in the open position with an E major chord like that, you can do in a barred position. Your fingers can just be pulled on and off, and they sort of create almost a formula for the different types of chords that you want to play. Major chord, major 7 chord, minor 7 chord, minor chord, and dominant 7 chord. And if you send me an envelope, I can mail that little system out to you, and it makes for cataloging those chords a lot easier than remembering a million different types of shapes of chords. You can put some logic behind it and figure out why a chord is called a major chord and why a chord is called a minor 7 chord. And once you remember that, you can just build those chords anywhere that you want them. You don't have to worry about a shape or a position or anything like that. But that dominant 7 chord we made out of the E major chord by just taking the pinky off. Well, you can take that dominant 7 chord and move it up 1 fret, just like we took off, just like we moved up the E major chord. You're going to have an F dominant 7, and an F sharp dominant 7, and a G, and an A, or a G and a G sharp, and an A, and an A sharp, and a B, and a C, and so on. Same with this A major chord. We turned it into an A dominant 7 chord. You can play that open string, or you can not play it, sort of an optional thing. And you can move those 2 fingers up 1 fret. That means you'll have to bar all of this stuff up 1 fret as well. You're going to play an A sharp dominant 7 there, and a B dominant 7, and a C, C sharp, and a D. So when you're using those bar chords, things tend to sound a little bit tighter. When you play an open chord, it's very resonant sounding and it rings real big. When you're playing a bar chord, things tend to be a little darker sounding. If you play a country tune, using bar chords like that, a G major, a C major, and a D major, or you play the same chords using open chords, you hear a subtle difference between the two. Open chords are usually used in rock, in sort of tunes like AC/DC kind of stuff, and simpler kind of more balls to the walls kind of stuff. Bar chords are used a lot in heavy metal because they're tighter and you can tend to play them really fast. They don't sustain a real long time. Like if you play a G major chord, dirty, it'll ring and ring and ring and ring. Whereas if you play a muted bar chord, it tends to die off right away, like that. So when guys like Metallica or something like that are playing that kind of stuff, they don't want a chord that's going to ring. It tends to get confusing sounding, and all the chords kind of mesh into one another, and they don't get any punch. So if you think you can, try to take those open progressions, those G major, C major, D major progressions that we looked at, and turn them into bar chords, G major, C major, and D major. You just have to look up the neck and find the root note that you want and play the quality of the chord, or the type of chord, be it major or dominant. And you can just experiment with it, play around with that, see what you like to do with it. As far as exercises to play these bar chords to just get your fingers strengthened, there's not a whole bunch of them. The best idea is just to take it 1 fret at a time, and you'll find that one of the most difficult things about playing bar chords when you're jumping from here to here to here is compensating for the distance between the frets. The frets get closer as you go up the neck, and when you try to play a bar chord up here, it can tend to be real tough because the notes are so tight together. So when you move up, you naturally have to pull your fingers together like that, and closer and closer and closer. And that'll get you, if you just play them up, it'll get you used to having to compress your hand and expand your hand to move with the fret spacing changing. Same with that form with the root on the A string. It might get a little confusing to do it. Another exercise to do is to play the chord with the root on the E string, followed by the chord with the root on the A string at the same fret. And you'll find that when you switch from a chord with the root on the E string to a chord with the root on the A string on the same fret, that it's really easy to just take your ring finger and just drop it down like that. Instead of taking your whole hand off and trying to reform the chord, just pull your index finger down a little bit to mute the low string, fret that one note, and drop your ring finger down on those notes. And you can kind of just even let your ring finger sort of just crawl up and walk onto that A string too. That you develop a real feel for it after a while. You don't even think about it until you sit down and talk about it. That A string, when you play it, you can almost feel it on your ring finger. And when you go to hit that chord, just kind of roll your ring finger up, and it'll sort of sit on that A string and fret it no problem. Your little finger should sort of hop out of the way and kind of stay away. Never tuck your finger behind. I know I told you there's no rules, but I'll make one. The reason you don't want to tuck your finger behind is that sometimes you want to add notes on top of the chords with your pinky. And if it's tucked behind, it's going to be a real effort, because most of our pinkies are fairly poppy and out of control. If your pinky's hanging over top of there, it's real easy to just drop down on the fingerboard and lift it off. You can run with it. Those exercises, again, are just ones that I've kind of just come up with that seem to just get your fingers going. They're really not that musical. Those chords don't have a whole bunch to do with one another, except that in the 1-4-5 progression that we've been talking about over and over and over, where you use a G major chord and a C major chord and a D major chord, or an E major chord, an A major chord, and make a B major chord out of moving that A up to a B. You will switch from the 1 chord, which would be a G, to the 5 chord, or to the 4 chord, which would be the C, quite often. So being able to change from the chord with the root on the E string to the chord with the root on the A string on the same fret is real handy if you can just do that without a lot of thought. Because when you play that 12-bar progression, you move to the 4 chord and back to the 1 chord and the 5. Find that your fingers will just sort of slide around and do what they can do. And things may feel uncomfortable and cumbersome and like you can't put enough pressure on the guitar when you start playing bar chords. But pressure is not really the key to it. See a lot of people, when they start to play bar chords, they're just leaning into them and trying to squeeze the heck out of the neck. That's not the key. What you want to do is roll your finger around, and subtle little finger position changes will apply the pressure on bones and muscle and skin and stuff like that in your fingers on the right spot on the string. It's more important for you to be precise about where you put your finger than to squeeze the heck out of it. If you've got your finger in the wrong spot, it doesn't matter how hard you're going to squeeze it, it's going to end up sounding deadened. But if you just press really lightly in the right spot, you'll be able to fret the notes and they'll ring clear. When you squeeze real hard on the neck, sometimes you tend to bend the string out of tune too. And so when you play bar chords, it's important to really try to relax your hand, or else things are going to sound out of tune. Another tendency people have is to, when they play a bar chord like that, their hand will be so stiff and it won't do what they want it to do that they'll end up bending one string and it'll start sounding like that, and then they think they're playing the chord wrong, and then they get confused. It's important to listen to these chords when you play them, but it's also important to know the chord well enough in your head, the picture of the chord, and to be able to transfer it to the fingerboard, and know it so well that you feel comfortable just forming the chord and playing it, whether it sounds bad or not. Have a look at the chord and see why you think it may be sounding bad. If you're stretching a string, if you're pushing too hard, maybe your finger's hanging over the fret too much and it's sounding dead. Maybe another finger is hanging down and touching one of the strings, and just a slight change in your hand position will fix it up. So work on that Nirvana song using E major, A major, G major, and C major. You can even hear the difference between the open chords and those bar chords. Just play around with that. And work on moving those bar chords up and down the neck and hopping between them. And just have some fun with it and make up your own rhythm patterns and all that kind of stuff. And send me an envelope with your name and address and a stamp on it, and I'll fire you out these lessons. And have a good week and good luck.